Welcome to another episode of Planet Possible. We're delighted that you're joining us to hear evidence-led discussion about topics that are critical to the way we manage our water, nature and climate. A huge thanks to our sponsors, Mackley, MWH Treatment and BMA, and you'll hear a little more about them later. We're really grateful for their support in bringing the pod to you. If you're new to Planet Possible, I'm Nikki Roach. I am a passionate advocate for all things water and environment and a fellow of CIWEM, the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. We're always interested in the connections between our systems here on Planet Possible. And in today's episode, we're going to be exploring how biocides, human-made chemicals that are in products like toothpaste and surface cleaner, are connected to our human microbiome and the environmental systems of water and soils. We'll be hearing from Baroness Natalie Bennett, a member of the UK House of Lords, who recently brought a private member's bill to Westminster to regulate the use of biocides. So to help us navigate this topic and think about how we might tackle these products once they're in our environment, I'm joined by Michael Mattle, the head of Wastewater Technology at the engineering firm Hollinger and co-head of the Wastewater Competence Centre of the Swiss Water Association. So, bienvenue à Possible Planète, Michael. I'm delighted to have you with us.
Bonjour, merci de m'avoir invité.
So, we're going to hear shortly from Natalie about the introduction of chemicals into the environment, which will inevitably have an impact on water quality. You're based in Switzerland, which has seen a transformation in water quality in its lakes over the last 50 years. Michael, what are some of the really significant changes you've made in Switzerland to bring about these improvements?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to say that we started much later than the UK in terms of wastewater treatment. We really started in the second half of last century constructing wastewater treatment plants where we first treated carbon and then phosphorus. At the same time that we started to treat phosphorus, there was also a bill that reduced phosphates, so the phosphates, they can't be removed from wastewater so that we can actually treat them very efficiently. So with this, we reduced both carbon pollution and phosphorus removal to the lakes. And then more recently, in 2016, the government decided to put in a new legislation on organic micropollutants, which we are now dealing with, where we treat organic micropollutants as a fourth treatment step, which Switzerland was the first country to legislate on.
I am really keen to hear more about exactly that shortly, but we're going to hear first from Natalie. So Natalie Bennett, the Baroness Bennett of Manor, has been a Green Party peer for 5 years, and she was previously the leader of the England and Wales Green Party from 2012 to 2016. Her first degree was in agricultural science, and she uses that background to work on antimicrobial resistance and broader issues of pollution and public health as one of her key topics in the UK House of Lords. So let's hear Natalie's views on biocides in our environment. Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle, Natalie, welcome to Planet Possible.
It's lovely to be on a planet where anything's possible.
Excellent. Let's start with a bit of context. So in January 2025, you introduced the Biocides Bill to the House of Lords to restrict the use of biocides in consumer products. What are biocides?
Biocides are substances that destroy living things, often pesticides, fungicides, herbicides. Just have to add a little addendum. This is consumer products intended for human use, just to get the definition in there precisely. So this is a bill about things like mouthwash, hand wash, body wash, toothpaste that contains biocides, which is we might come back to. So it's products that are being sold to consumers in the marketplace that you don't have to go and talk to a chemist or anything. We're not talking about medical products here. We're talking about things you find essentially on the shelf in the supermarket.
And why are you advocating for them to be restricted?
What we're concerned about here is three issues. These are biocides, so these are things that kill particularly microbes. The first thing to note is, of course, that we've, in the last 20 years or so, come to understand that there is a human microbiome. We are actually holobionts. We consist of about 50,000 species. Most people would probably have heard of a gut microbiome. There's started to be a lot of focus recently on the oral microbiome and its linked to mental health. You have a vaginal microbiome, you have a skin microbiome, you have a lung microbiome. So we've got all of these microbes that are part of our body, and yet we're just splashing around these materials to kill them. The second level of concern is about antimicrobial resistance, often known as AMR. We've got a real problem with lots of our drugs, our pharmaceuticals in modern medicine are stopping working, the antibiotics and the antifungals, because the organisms are becoming resistant to them. And the more and more we splash around, there was a research paper out last year showing that we've increased massively the amount of resistance genes on this planet. And people might recall 2018, David Cameron, back when he was Prime Minister in the UK, came out and said, this is as big a threat to us as the climate emergency. He said that we risk losing human medicine. Basically, all of modern medicine depends, whether it's a hip replacement, whether it's a kidney transplant, whether it's just, fixing because you've scratched your finger on a rose. All of those things, the drugs that we use now and we expect to work, we can't guarantee they'll keep working because of AMR. And then the third thing is all of the environmental impacts. And this is where I think we'll get back to water later. Of course, all of this is just literally being washed down the drain. It is ending up in our water supplies. And these are very active chemicals that are going to be impacting on the microbial life, impacting on all life that water then comes in contact with.
So, Natalie, are there any occasions where these products should be legitimately added, given that it sounds like we're finding them in conventional over-the-counter mouthwashes and so on? So is there a legitimate reason why they should be there?
There's a legitimate reason for these to be used for medical reasons. Now, that means if you have, someone with a diabetic ulcer may need a whole lot of applications of antibiotics to get rid of the infection in that ulcer. It may be that chlorhexidine, which is in a large amounts of our mouthwash, which may not be needed for standard use, but there may be occasions when you might go to the dentist or go to the pharmacist and explain your problem, and it might be appropriate for chlorhexidine to be in the mouthwash. It's not saying never use them in any product whatsoever. It's a case of saying that we shouldn't just be putting them out there. And why are they in there? I mean, that's an interesting question, because one of the things that we've seen is an explosion in the use of these substances. And the reason for that is essentially advertising. You'll have seen lots of these products, people who are listening to this might go out and see a billboard or see an advert on their computer screen saying, kills 99% of bacteria, advertising something as antibacterial or antifungal, and of course COVID helped to magnify this. It's used as an advertising thing. People suggest that it's better. But actually, and this is actually the US FDA just a few months ago, explicitly put out a statement restating its position that antibacterial soap is absolutely no better than just standard soap. Antibacterial hand washes are totally unnecessary, and in fact they're harmful. But people go and look at the supermarket and see how many things have that in fairly large print on the front of the bottle. It's essentially being used for advertising purposes, and it's helping to poison our planet.
Gosh, it's so interesting, because you can totally see, and particularly probably exacerbated by COVID, how we have got swept up into that. If it's anti-bac, if it's antimicrobial, then it's better. But actually, as you say, it's a really key part of our human systems to have those bugs there. So globally, is the UK alone in looking to restrict these? You talked a little bit there about the FDA in the States. So what's the kind of global position?
The States, for example, I mean, who knows what might happen in the future, but at the present moment, they are significantly ahead of us. And one of the famous examples of this is triclosan in hand washes, which was identified as a huge problem and banned a decade ago by the US in hand washes. You could still go into a supermarket shelf in the UK now and you will find many products containing triclosan. So the UK is far behind many other parts of the world, even behind the United States on this. What's different about this bill and this approach, and this is something that I've developed with a series of interns and supporters from the British Society for Antimicrobial Chemotherapy and from the Centre for Long-Term Resilience, is that we're saying no biocides. What approach the US and most other places have taken is they have banned one particular product. But of course, this creates what's known as the whack-a-mole problem, in that if you ban this product, and we've seen this with PFASs, for example, the forever chemicals, you ban one product and they just produce another, probably even worse environmental and public health impact. So what we're saying is starting from the basis of let's stop this unless you can show there is a really good reason. Because one of the other things I haven't talked about yet, which is really worth mentioning, is treated clothing. You might get antibacterial socks, or I've been working separately in a related issue on an amendment to the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill to regulate period products. And as the Women's Environmental Network says, there is more regulation about what goes into your ornamental candle than what goes into your tampon. What's been put in lots of these antibacterial products, particularly in reusable period products, period pants, has been silver, nanosilver, which is antibacterial. Now, there's actually research showing this is bad for the vaginal microbiome, but also showing that within a few washes, most of it washes out into the environment. And again, we're in here for commercial reasons here. Wool and cotton are naturally antibacterial. They add this substance, this silver, to mostly artificial fibres socks, which of course also brings in the whole other issue of microplastics and plastic fibres out in the environment. So we've got all of these products that are just being put out for advertising reasons.
It's absolutely fascinating. I think as a relatively uninformed consumer, I maybe take it for granted that these things are safe and all this has been thought through. Where are you up to with the bill? Obviously, January you took the Biocides bill to the Lords. What happens next with it?
Okay, well, this is where I need to stress, so no one gets too excited, that this is a private member's bill, and private members' bills almost never become law. They're really more of an educative process, a way of bringing the issue to the forefront. The ideal case is what happens very often is you have a private member's bill, and 10 years later that bill will be incorporated in a government bill and become law. Now, I think this is all so urgent, for reasons we might discuss later, that I think we've got to move much faster than this. But to answer the technical question, we've had the second reading, and anyone who wants to see the discussion about this, we had a really high quality discussion in the House of Lords on this with lots of people engaged and involved. If you look up second reading Biocides bill, you'll find it in Hansard, the record of everything that's recorded in the British Parliament. So we've had the second reading. We will then go to committee stage. Now, one of the people who took part in second reading put down some positive amendments. We'll see if other amendments come forward. It can be stopped at this stage if people want to essentially filibuster, a word Americans will be familiar with. It can be filibustered. Hopefully it will not be. Hopefully it will go through the next stages in the House of Lords and will clear the House of Lords. And then it goes down to the Commons. But it won't progress. I can always remain in hope, but I wouldn't claim to anyone that's a likely outcome.
Well, it's a really interesting lesson in how the UK Parliament works. Thank you. And we'll definitely put the Hansard link in the show notes. But it does feel really urgent. Let's lift it up a level from the specifics of the bill in that case then. So I am really interested in what the system-wide impacts are of the kind of products that you've given us a canter through there. So give me a sense of why this is important to you beyond the specifics of at an individual level this has an impact.
Well, I see this as part of a very broad attempt to change the way we all think. I have a book out at the moment called Change Everything, and this is part of my small steps towards changing everything. One of the things we need to change is that if I go to public meetings, sometimes someone will ask me, so should we just make every decision on the basis of the climate impacts? And they're quite surprised when I say, no, we shouldn't, because climate is just one of the ways in which we're breaking the planetary boundaries, we're destroying this planet. And if we don't look at this all holistically as a problem, then we get into situations as we did with the Dieselgate affair. People may recall this was a case of massive corruption in car manufacturing companies, that they cheated on what emissions were coming out of diesel cars. But behind that was they'd gone to the diesel cars because people concluded, oh, well, diesel cars produce less climate change emissions than do petrol cars, so we'll encourage everyone to switch from petrol to diesel cars. But the problem was that diesel cars produce a huge amount of other pollutants, particularly that impact on human health and cause all sorts of other damage. And so if you just look at climate, you're making bad decisions. So how do we make these decisions? I mean, I go to the Stockholm Resilience Centre planetary boundaries, and they identify 9 planetary boundaries. Now, I wouldn't say this is perfect, but at least give us an attempt at a holistic, an Earth system science approach to decision making. Climate is the one everyone knows about. Most people probably know about and talk a bit about the biodiversity, the collapse in natural systems. This whole biocides is part of a broader issue of what's known as novel entities, which is unfortunately the worst named planetary boundary ever. But novel entities, for my shorthand, are pesticides, pharmaceuticals and plastics. There's all of these substances that essentially nature has no mechanism to deal with, that are toxic to life. And we are spraying them out into the environment in huge quantities. And one of the things that perhaps when we get to water we might talk more about effect is we have almost no understanding of the cocktail effect. So the way in which your body, the animal drinking at the stream, the algae in the stream isn't just exposed to one of these things. And if we test it at all, we'll usually just test the impact of one of these things. It's got this whole cocktail of pesticides, pharmaceuticals, microplastics, nanoplastics, bombarding it from all sides. And so the novel entities boundary, it's part of that broader thing. But yet we've also got to think of biophysical flows, which is basically phosphates and nitrates in our water supply. I'm sure many of your listeners will know a great deal about that. So it's an attempt to start with some very specific things that could do positive things, but also get people thinking about we have to live within the physical limits of this one fragile planet. And more than that, my green politics, if you like, comes to the understanding that we could all have a decent life. We can look after climate and nature. if we use the resources of the planet, care for them, and share them out fairly. And that's the foundational place. So I'm going from the tampons and the mouthwash, going right through to changing everything.
MWH Treatment is one of the UK's leading water and wastewater process contractors. MWH offers a truly integrated design and build service that's uniquely dedicated to the water industry. With an innovative and future-facing approach, everything MWH does is guided by its purpose to shape a better world. BMA is a next-gen AI decision intelligence software company. Their cloud-based platform, Decisio, redefines how water and energy companies approach their infrastructure planning to make better, faster and more connected critical decisions, simultaneously achieving net zero, resilience and financial sustainability. I love it. I love the fact that we've gone right down from that detail up to the big picture stuff. And we'll pop a link in the show notes to the 9 planetary boundaries because it's a really interesting set of framing. So we touched a little bit there on the kind of cocktail effect that you talked about. What do we know from the products that you're talking about with the Biocides bill? What do we know about their impact on our wider environmental systems, things like water and soils?
Very little is the short answer. I mean, I've had interns working with me, particularly from Exeter University, who's doing a lot of really excellent research on here. A lot of this is so new and it's not funded because who's going to fund this? Because pharma companies want to fund things that will get products approved. Governments have cut massively their amount of funding. Environmental funding is under extreme threat. We'll park the US for the moment, but it's, I'm sure, in everybody's mind. We don't really know, but this is where I think the other sort of really important principle that we need to bring in here is the precautionary principle. Now, this is something that actually was signed up to, the previous government signed up to it through the Environment Act. The world is signed up through UN principles. And that's if we don't know if something's going to make a mess, maybe we should just not do it. Lip service is paid very often to the precautionary principle, but actually you just look at what's happening. You think of what's in the stream, in the river, down the road from your house, and we are pumping all of these materials into them, and we haven't given any thought at all to the impacts. There's another classic example of this people might recall, and this was in some ways an environmental success story, microbeads. Somehow or other, it was decided that putting tiny bits of plastic in face scrubs, into toothpaste, into all sorts of substances that were naturally going to be washed down the sink, they replaced ground up apricot kernels and such like because the plastic was a fractionally cheaper. And no one stopped and asked, but what's going to happen to all of this plastic? And what's the impact going to be? Now, that's one case where actually we saw rapid action. I mean, again, the US actually acted before us on this. Back in the day, Congress, with almost total unanimity, both sides of the House passed the bill to ban microbeads in cosmetic products. The UK followed a few months later. But that was one tiny fraction of what we're actually putting out there.
And I wonder as well whether some of that is because you can see it. You can physically see the plastic pollution happening with the microbead, can't you? There's something very tangible, and I wonder whether it's sometimes harder for people to get behind this because it's almost invisible. We're talking about things that are inside products that we can't see, we can't taste, we can't experience in some respects. It's kind of passive, and whether therefore it's harder for people to feel as animated about it.
I think when we're talking about biocides, I think what we need is a real transformation of thinking. We sort of know about the microbiome, although way most people will have learned about it is by someone advertising to them a product that will improve your gut microbiome usually. What actually will improve your microbiome is eating a healthy, balanced diet mixed with a wide range of fruit and vegetables. What we've got to do is actually move on to thinking about microbes, life. We need to look after life. And so it's not the case of going, there's a bacteria, kill it. Because actually this doesn't touch on things like surface sprays, etc. Because there is, some arguments for using them. There are some case uses where you do need them. But if you spray your kitchen top unnecessarily with it kills 99.9% of bacteria, what you're leaving is the 0.1% of bacteria that are resistant to what you've just sprayed it with, which are going to colonise the whole area left by the space where what you've killed everything else. And understanding those principles of life, those principles of understanding that bacteria, fungi, all the other microbes, they are part of our life, they are part of us, and they are part of our world. And we want to keep all of that in balance, not go round spraying things to kill them every time we get the chance.
This is such an enlightening conversation, Natalie. It's making me really think about more generally, the products that we use in our homes, the products that we put on ourselves, and how much of those is influenced by messages that we receive from companies?
Perhaps we can just touch on one of the things that I think is wrong with our education system is it forces pupils to go through exam after exam after exam like a sausage factory. What we actually need is education for life, to prepare people to live in the world. And, at best, that's shoved into the odd corner when the exams are over in school curriculums through no fault of teachers. And, some teachers try and squeeze some of this stuff in. But we're not educating people for a healthy life. We're educating them to pass exams.
My professional life, I've been in conversations this week, and often the challenges around climate change have been about how do we educate, how do we help people understand more so they can make better informed decisions. It feels like, in general, actually, there is a gap there. Somebody talked about the Keep Britain Tidy campaign that those of a certain generation, I will certainly remember. That kind of public education campaign done in a way that's engaging, but there's gaps.
If you look back to this very well-documented history of where that started in America, and it was companies like Coca-Cola that were being blamed for all the litter that suddenly started to appear on the countryside when single-use packaging first and bottles and things that started to appear. And so they invented the term litter bug. And they held this all to individual responsibility, whereas what we should be really holding responsible is the companies that make this stuff. I'm not really concerned about individual behaviour. I'm concerned about system change. You should be able to go into a supermarket and know that everything that you can buy in there, even into a pharmacy, what you can buy off the shelf, that it's the right sort of thing. It will do what it says on the label and it won't do damage. But we don't know that now.
Oh, so much to think about. Natalie, thank you. Final question. I ask all my guests this. I'm going to pass you the Planet Possible magic wand. Give it a wave. We've covered a lot today, so you can make anything possible. What's the one thing that you'd want?
If we were going to talk about the whole world, in change everything, what I want to do is introduce a universal basic income. But to bring it back to the kind of topics we're talking about today, I think what I want is for people to take antimicrobial resistance really seriously, to understand that modern medicine is absolutely on the cusp of whether we are going to be able to keep modern medicine, and to understand that that means we've got to be vastly more careful with our use of antibiotics and antifungals, and that means essentially the end of factory farming of animals. It means a huge transformation of industrial agriculture. It means stopping companies running wild and ensuring that they can't do harm. It implies bringing the precautionary principle into everything associated with AMR. That can be the model for everything else.
Well, my brain is spinning, but in a good way. Thank you so much for joining us, Natalie. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much. I've very much enjoyed it. I do get a chance to have an audience with which I can go a little bit geeky, so I've got a little bit geeky today.
The Planet Possible listeners are definitely your people, I promise. Mackley is a civil engineering contractor specialising in water sector infrastructure, coastal projects and river works. Striving for a sustainable future, Mackley helps communities prepare better for climate change, maintain water security and enhance biodiversity. With a proud 98-year history, Mackley continues to skillfully tackle the most challenging and complex projects in water. OK, Michael, so what are your initial reflections on what we've heard from Natalie?
One thing which I really find interesting is her statement that she says we should stop using compounds unless they're really needed. And one example I give to my students at EPFL at the University in Lausanne is about insecticides that you can buy for households. I made a computation based on the Rhone River where you can buy a bottle in any supermarket as insecticides for your gardening. And if you pour in a bottle of half a liter, you actually already exceed quality standards in the Rhone River, which is a very decent river system in Switzerland. So what you can buy on the market can be extremely toxic, and even if you dilute it many times, it still remains toxic for certain organisms. Another thing that she said, which I find extremely interesting, is a holistic approach of environmental issues. And I think as we move forward, this becomes more and more important because this treatment of organic micropollutants actually has an impact on the climate, not a very major impact, but has an impact on the climate. So this holistic approach requires a lot of knowledge and also an open mind. And people often think too much in boxes. So to really tackle problems, you need to think more globally. And then the last point I really like is this precautionary principle. And probably a lot of difficulties we're facing now, like cancer, fertility, diminishing, is probably caused by environmental problems, environmental pollution of the air, of the water, and also of our food. It's very difficult to prove that it actually comes from the environment, and it often takes a long time until you can prove it, and you already have these pollutants then in the environment. So the precautionary principle is probably, from a political point of view, not very easy to push forward. But if you think about what it actually costs to clean up afterwards, it may be much more interesting. And I think this should be an argument. We're talking a lot about PFAS today. For the industries, these compounds were very useful, but the impact that we have now for a lot of uses that could have been done with other chemicals that are biodegradable, and we wouldn't have so much problem. So I think this is an important thing. And I think also that this has to be done with the industry and not against the industry. Industry is often putting itself as a victim. But if we go this way and we try to produce compounds that are more biodegradable, that we can actually easily remove at the wastewater treatment plant, that's probably the way forward. This needs time. We need to basically change how we perceive things.
I was really interested to hear Natty's reflections, lifting it right up to those planetary boundaries and actually thinking about, there's only so far you can push any of these systems before something fundamental might change. Her talking about potentially the breakdown of modern medicine through antimicrobial resistance was, objectively quite frightening to hear, really. So I thought it was really interesting that she thinks in systems in the way she does, bringing it back to the world that you and I are more familiar with, those kind of environmental systems. It's fascinating to then think about, well, how do you take a system view on all of this? So let's do that. I'm really interested in what you're doing in Switzerland for managing pollutants that are in the wastewater. Tell me a little bit about what you are taking out and how you're doing that.
For the moment, it's not all wastewater treatment plants. It's mainly the big wastewater treatment plants, intermediate-sized treatment plants that reject into rivers that end up in a lake, which can be used as drinking water sources, and also rivers that have a very poor dilution of wastewater. So those wastewater treatment plants we are currently equipping with a fourth treatment step, which is either ozonation or activated carbon-based technologies. So either you oxidize the compounds. If you oxidize the compounds, you usually immediately change the structure of the molecule, which has its bioeffect. So by changing the molecule, once you're not completely degrading it, you often reduce toxicity dramatically. Or activated carbon, which adsorbs the compounds. And then you remove this activated carbon from the wastewater and you remove the pollutants. What we achieve with these treatment steps is we remove compounds that are badly biodegradable, that we couldn't remove so far with biological treatment, which is the main treatment step in wastewater treatment plants. So we can remove those compounds further. For a whole list of compounds, our objective is to remove them at a removal yield of 80%.
So give me an example of some of the things that you're able to take out with that fourth process step that you couldn't do with more traditional wastewater treatment. What kind of things are you taking out?
Pharmaceuticals, pesticides, these are probably the two compounds also which have the biggest effect on the environment.
And when Natalie talks about biocides, is that something that's on your radar?
Biocides are like insecticides and pesticides, so yes, we remove them. Both ozonation and activated carbon are treatment processes that were chosen because they have a very broad elimination rates. So we can actually remove a broad range of compounds. We cannot remove all the compounds, like PFAS is very water soluble, and we can actually barely remove it with the technologies that we apply or with the dosages we apply.
Yeah, we've talked before on Planet Possible about forever chemicals, things like PFASs and PFOAs. It's a real challenge. So I know that the EU is now catching up with what you're doing in Switzerland, but you were ahead of EU legislation. What's driven the approach that you've taken in Switzerland?
20 years ago or 15 years ago, there were several studies of the Federal Office for the Environment that did a lot of modeling of compounds within our river systems, and they realized that with the current treatment status, a lot of compounds we can't reduce below toxicity levels. So this was modeling that was done. And at the same time, there was also federal funding to test these technologies in a large scale. So out of the lab into pilot scale testing, which was nationally funded testing. And based on these results, legislation was prepared. One of the reasons why this may have happened in Switzerland is because of ERWAG, which is based in Zurich, in Dübendorf, which is a research institute on water. And they have a very close collaboration with consulting firms and the water industry. So this also helped to make this transfer from the lab to large scale and then build up on this.
And Michael, you said at the start that this was wastewater treatment works that were discharging into either rivers with poor dilution or into water bodies that were then drinking water sources. So in essence, it's kind of like a final effluent reuse scheme, it strikes me, in that you're cleaning that up so much so that it can become drinking water again. Is there any appetite in Switzerland to extend these technologies to sites where those things are not the case? So it's a regular river with a normal amount of dilution that doesn't immediately go into a drinking water source, for example. Is there an environmental driver here, or is it a public health driver?
I mean, all the drinking water sources that we use from surface water still have a relatively good dilution, so it's not really direct wastewater reuse. So you have dilution, and also pollutants get degraded in natural systems. It's interesting to put these waters into the river systems and then recover them, use them for treatment afterwards. What we now work on in Switzerland, the government, the Federal Office for the Environment, in 2021 introduced quality standards for certain compounds, out of which you have diclofenac, which is a painkiller, which actually has problematic concentrations in a lot of river systems. So you're above ecotoxicological levels in a lot of river systems, and the actual criteria that define which wastewater treatment plants have to install such a fourth treatment step are insufficient. So now we're working on a new bill which will go beyond. The objective is really to get all these river systems below this quality standard, so that the concentrations are below these quality standards. And this is now under preparation. It has to be voted by Parliament in some 3 or 4 years.
And what level of monitoring is carried out on water quality generally in Switzerland? Is there quite a lot of kind of real-time monitoring, the occasional sample? Give me a sense of how aware, I guess, the Swiss public and then professionals are of water quality in Switzerland.
It's not so much done on a federal basis. I mean, Switzerland has a very strong, cantons, so the regions, they have their own authorities with a lot of power, and it's often done at this stage so that the cantons actually look into the quality of waters. And as we have 26 cantons or 23 and 6.5 cantons, depending on where you look at, you have more or better information. But in general, I think we have a lot of information about the water quality. And it's also an argument to say that we take care of these river systems because the Swiss are attached to good water quality.
I was lucky enough to be in Geneva earlier on this year and went and visited Lake Geneva, which I'd never been to see before. And I was absolutely blown away by the visual quality of the water in that lake, and there were people swimming in it, but there were also boats on it. It's absolutely massive as well. I don't think I'd appreciated how large Lake Geneva is. You could see it was a source of real pride, and right in the centre of this very busy city, this extraordinarily beautiful water body. So it strikes me that it sounds like it's really ingrained in Swiss culture, that there's that kind of take care of waterways approach, really.
And it's something relatively recent, because some 70 years ago, nobody swam in Lake Geneva, or you took a boat to go in the center of Lake Geneva to actually swim in it, because it was disgusting. And only with the wastewater treatment that was put into place, this was actually possible.
So how are Swiss wastewater treatment services funded and managed?
So the communities have to manage, so it's a task of the communities to manage the wastewater treatment. They are all owned by the communities and run by the communities, sometimes by associations, because wastewater treatment may be treated for several communities. So then you have associations. The funding is based on water consumption. So in each household you have a meter, and this meter will tell you how much you have to pay for drinking water supply and wastewater treatment.
So I think what I'm hearing is it's a publicly funded, it's almost like a tax in essence. You're paying via the amount that you use, but it's going through local government or local associations. That's how it's funded. We're having lots of discussions here in the UK about the future of water, so it's always interesting to hear how others are doing it. So what are some of the future challenges that you're facing in Switzerland? What's next?
We really have a lot of challenges. There's this bill that asks to go further with treatment of organic micropollutants. So we're going to, most probably, if the Parliament will vote for it, we'll go into much broader application of these treatment units. So we will have to construct many more treatment units. There is also a bill asking that we do go further with nitrogen removal than for the organic micropollutants treatment. So there we also want to go a big step forward to reduce nutrients, but at the same time it will also allow to reduce laughing gas emissions, which is a very strong climate gas, so greenhouse gas. About 2% of greenhouse emissions in Switzerland are due to wastewater treatment. So if we can reduce nitrogen at the effluent, we'll also reduce significantly the greenhouse gas emissions of our wastewater treatment plants. And at the same time, what we also want to focus at the Swiss Water Association is we try to avoid that compounds that we can't remove or are difficult to remove, that they don't end up in the wastewater. So this will be another difficult task. And I think both have to go at a certain speed, because what we do now, this barrier will allow us to remove large amount of compounds, but it's not an absolute barrier. So we will always have compounds that we will not be able to treat. So we would really appreciate if we don't have to go even further with the wastewater treatment, but avoid putting in chemicals in the wastewater that we can actually not remove.
And that takes us nicely back to what we heard from Natalie, really, which is about stopping things getting in the first place if we can. Much easier to stop than it is to take out. So final question for you, Michael. I'm going to pass you the Planet Possible magic wand. Give it a wave. You can make anything possible in this space. What would you want?
That we stop producing chemicals that are extremely resistant. Toxicity is one thing, and proving that something is toxic is very difficult. It may turn up much later than we actually realize, or we don't know it in the beginning and then it turns out to be toxic and then we start trying to find a solution. Whereas if we try at least to stop producing chemicals that are extremely stable and not biodegradable, to put these chemicals on the market, I think we'll go a big step forward also for future generations, because it's them that will have to clean up those pollutants.
Yep, I think from everything I've heard from you and Natalie today, I'm in complete agreement. We've got to think about those system-wide impacts of the things that we put in and where they're going to end up. As ever, time has flown by, and here we are at the end of another episode of Planet Possible. Thank you for joining us. I hope you found the conversation insightful. I hope it's given you something to think about in your world. If you want to find out more about the projects we've talked about today, or be the first to hear about new episodes, check out the links in the show notes. And if you don't already, then subscribe to Planet Possible on your podcast app and we'll magically appear in your feed. We've got more fantastic guests and topics lined up for the rest of this year, so I do hope you'll join us for those. And all that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to my superb guest, Baroness Natalie Bennett, our sponsors, Mackley, MWH Treatment and BMA, and my wonderful co-host, Michael Mattle. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
That's it, everyone. Stay curious, stay connected, and we'll see you next time.